Hello everyone, Father Brett here. Welcome to Sermon Prep. So good to have you along with us. We're looking forward to the 24th Sunday of Ordinary Time, and of course we're still in Year A. Let's have a look at the readings, shall we? The first reading is taken from the book of Sirach, chapter 27, verse 30, and then chapter 28, verse 7. The responsorial psalm is Psalm 103, and the little verse that we use to respond: "The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and rich in mercy." The second reading is from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 14, verses 7 to 9. And then our gospel is Matthew's gospel, chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. If you don't mind, I would like to look at the first reading first this week, because it links into the first part, especially the first part of the gospel. And I think the gospel will sort of make a little bit more sense if we've got a bit of background from the first reading. You will remember, I hope, that in Old Testament times there used to be retribution. If somebody did something wrong, you were entitled to exact vengeance and retribution on them. And we know that over time, as we read the Old Testament, we can see that this getting justice for a wrong done slowly evolves and changes. At the time of Lamech, it would have been you could do whatever you wanted to somebody who had harmed you. Your vengeance could be unlimited. And we see the development where we get to, we all know that famous saying, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We know, because we've talked about this before, that wasn't so that, it was exactly, take somebody's eye out or punch them in the mouth and get a tooth from them. No, but it was trying to get people to see that justice, vengeance, all those retribution, had to be proportional. You couldn't go crazy when somebody had just stolen a chicken from you. You couldn't go and kill them for that. That the justice had to be proportional to the injustice done. And so we see that development. Today we're a little bit further along. And if you remember, Sirach is a wisdom book. It forms part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And so people who act wisely act in proportion to the wrong done to them. That we actually need to forgive, to put aside, and to try to find reconciliation and healing. That's what wise people do. And so this first reading is a progression, is a development of this justice story. Okay, all of us have had bad things done to us. All of us have had an injustice visited on us, and when we do experience those, when we feel hurt or unfairly put upon, we want to retaliate. We want to respond, and so often our response is over exaggerated. We go crazy, don't we? But the reading today, the first reading, speaks about being wise, being careful. And it makes very clear that when we're able to forgive, we're actually exhibiting a divine property. That when we don't hold grudges, when we don't harbor anger, when we seek healing, we're acting like God. We're starting to live as God calls us to, as God's people. This is how it ends, that first reading. Remember the commandments and do not be angry with your neighbor. Remember the covenant of the Most High and overlook ignorance. Commandments, covenant, relationship with us. God in relationship with us. And so if God is in relationship with me, a sinner, He loves me, He calls me to live in a certain way, He knows that I sin, but still He loves me. And so when we acknowledge the failings of others and still are able to exhibit forgiveness and love towards them, we are acting like the God who is in covenant, in relationship with us. Okay, so a really very good reading for us. So how does it link to the gospel? Well, remember, we're in the 18th chapter. We're coming to the end of the 18th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. And remember, I had said that the 18th chapter is looking at community life, is looking at how members of the church should behave. Matthew's community has obviously had disagreements, okay? And so Matthew is trying to help them to understand how they should live together. And one of the things, clearly, as we get from the first few verses, is that there are disagreements. We heard about those last week in our gospel, remember? There are disagreements. There are things that make us angry with one another. What are we to do? So you can see there's now a development again from the Old Testament times of justice and forgiveness. Because in Old Testament times, as we've just seen in the first reading, Sirach says we need to be forgiving. But how forgiving? And the rabbis would have taught that you should forgive. You should forgive, and those especially close, you can forgive more than once or twice. You know, maybe your wife or your husband or your children, your closest friends, you could forgive them more than once. But more than 4 times? No. That was sort of the rabbinical teaching. 4 times was the maximum. So Peter goes to Jesus. Peter, the symbol of the community, symbol of the church. It's interesting that Matthew has Peter ask the question because it's a church issue, obviously, chapter 18. Peter's actually being generous 7 times. That's 3 more than the 4. And Jesus says, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. So in many ways, Jesus is knocking it out the park, isn't he? And so compared to Lamech in the Old Testament that wanted unlimited vengeance on even the smallest injustice, Jesus, at the other end of the scale of this development of justice, saying unlimited forgiveness for whatever crime or hurt that has been placed upon us, that we have received. So Jesus is sort of continuing that development of justice and punishment and acting in a right way, to take it to the exact extreme of what Lamech had done. So that's the first part of the gospel. Then the second part is this parable of the 2 servants. That's how this chapter ends. That obviously the community made up of servants, and I don't think Matthew means a menial sort of street sweeper person. He's not talking servants as menial servants. Anybody who is under the master. So for all of us, we are all servants of the gospel. Jesus is the master. So that, I think, is a clear link for us. I think we get that. But we know that the amount forgiven that first servant is astronomical. Hey? It is huge. If we look at it, this is what Sam Borak writes. There is first the sums of money involved. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian, the entire tax revenue of Judea came only to about 600 talents. So 10,000 talents would have been an astronomical amount of money. And so there's this parable, the story is a huge exaggeration, isn't it? This servant has been forgiven beyond all thought. It's just huge. And yet he doesn't forgive his fellow servant the relatively tiny amount. And so the whole idea of forgiveness, acting like the master, comes out really clearly for us in this story. But perhaps the closing words of the gospel are encouraging for us. Huh? So, also, my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. And that's to us, the community, the church. Huh? Life in the community entails costly love. Yeah, it's sometimes hard to forgive, but we're expected to. Okay? So then the second reading is the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. And the first part of, the first part of this chapter 14, verses 1 to 6, which we don't find in our reading for this Sunday. We find the following two verses 7 to 9. But the other verses that precede, 1 to 6, perhaps go and have a look at that. So what's happening in the community? Verses 1 to 6 tells us there are the strong and the weak. St. Paul uses those titles, the strong and the weak. The strong are the sort of more progressive, who think they live just by love. And the weak are those who hold on to the older traditions. And so there's conflict between them. Sounds familiar? Yeah, in the church today, there's still conflicts between traditionalists and more progressives. And Paul is saying that we need to recognize these differences, and we need to treat each other with respect. We need to treat each other with love, and that's what the verses we read about in today's second reading, or the Sunday's second reading, are about. It's not about what we want. Hey? If we're going to live for the Lord, then we've got to recognize one another, help one another, love one another. We cannot be living just for ourselves and our own ideas and thoughts. It'd be good advice for some people in our modern church, wouldn't it? Okay. And the psalm, of course, fits in beautifully. Slow to anger is the Lord and rich in mercy. Can we do that this coming week? Can we be forgiving? Can we be slow to anger? Can we forgive those who have hurt us? Because as the first reading reminds us, that is to be like God. God is forgiving, and we are called to be like God. Okay, so some background to the readings for this 24th Sunday of Ordinary Time. I hope to see everybody at the church, but if you can't make it, of course, join us online. Take care, everyone. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.